Hello everyone, I'm Shailen Kasera from ASHRAE Rajasthan chapter. I welcome you on behalf of ASHRAE India chapter and ASHRAE Rajasthan chapter. Today we have ASHRAE distinguished lecturer Mr. E. Michel Swan for webinar presentation on design, build, executing the project. Mr. Swan has over 30 years of experience in the areas of engineering design, project management and consulting for a wide array of clients in diverse industries in the US and abroad. Mr. Swan's career had started engineering design of HVAC, piping and control system, project and department management, commissioning, forensics, engineering and expert witness engagements, and dispute resolution and project execution consulting. Mr. Swan has authored several articles on the subject of project execution and professional practice. Mr. Swan is active in several technical committees within ASHRAE, including TC 1.7, General Business, Management and Legal Education, TC 2.8, Sustainable Design, TC 7.1, Integrated Design, TC 7.2, HVAC, Design Build, and TC 9.11, Clean Spaces. So before handing over to Mr. Swan, I request all the participants to raise the query through question tab. Mr. Swan will give your answer after the presentation. Recording of this webinar will be available on YouTube channel of ASHRAE Rajasthan chapter. Now I would like to request Mr. Swan to deliver the presentation. Over to you, sir, Mr. Swan.
All right, thank you very much. Good evening to everyone. For me, it's good morning. It's about 9 a.m. in Philadelphia. Thank you very much. Sorry I can't be with you directly. I have been to India a couple of times and greatly enjoyed it, including Jaipur. So sorry to miss this opportunity, but we will do this. This is probably my first go-to webinar for ASHRAE, so I may be a little rocky. So what we're going to do here is get the there we go, get the slides going. There we go. So the presentation I'm going to give is much more about project execution than sort of the detailed aspects of design, and it is based on the ASHRAE Design Build Survival Guide, which is a publication you can get. It is currently being revised and updated. I was a co-author in the original version, and I am now also a co-author on the updated version. So very quickly, our learning objectives today. Basically, we're going to try and get an understanding of the design, build, execution strategies, some methods to get it done, some concerns and cautions, things you need to watch out for. Now, as I understand it, design build has become is becoming a much more popular execution strategy in India and actually around the world. And there may be some aspects of our current condition that accelerate some of that. But one of the things about design build is it is a collaborative kind of process, and human cooperation can be both very useful and at times not so helpful. So that's a thought to consider. So I don't know how many people are familiar with design build or have done it, but design build is a process where the design build entity holds all the contracts with all the trade contractors. It also holds the design contract. So the design build entity, and I say entity because there are different ways they can be formed, has all the risk of performance, design, and workmanship, as well as cost. Okay, so they basically carry all the risk. The owner hopefully gets a single point of responsibility. The owner only has to talk to the design builder, and the expectation is it would save time and money on the project. So, as I mentioned, why do it? That's saving time and money. As you can see from this slide here, and I'll try and illustrate with my cursor, the thing that is predominantly the savings is that whole bidding process is somewhat removed, because with a set of preliminary drawings, one should try and get a full price established and then work through detailed drawings. So at a minimum, you hopefully would save the time it takes for a bid process, a tendering process, or you can save even more, because what's happening here is using a preliminary set of documents, you can begin construction. And so now you are working on portions of the drawings and simultaneously constructing other portions of the work. To achieve some of that in the design bid build world, what we've done is going to fast track construction, where you're releasing packages, foundations, structural steel, envelope, MEP comes a little later. But basically the premise is I can save time at this back end because I've compressed these two portions of work into one component right here. How big is the market? Well, from a global perspective, the market is growing, although the impacts of the coronavirus, we'll see what that does to the construction market. But South and Southeast Asia have been experiencing some pretty rapid growth in the construction market in general. Okay, so somewhere around 6% growth. If you want to look at that a little bit more finely, India, and we see here 4 to 6%. India is somewhere around 4 to 6%, 5% growth on the construction market in average. What's interesting on this chart is to see the areas that are in the very dark kind of maroon color. You'll see that Egypt is a high growth area, as are a large number of East African countries, which I think is interesting to see. And there's some spots in Southeast Asia, Vietnam here, and that would be Myanmar, I believe. So there's some growth in some other areas too. So I think that it's interesting to see some of the areas of growth that you wouldn't typically expect in construction markets. So what about the dynamics of the market in India specifically? And keeping in mind, time and money are the two drivers that are sort of making people want to go into design build. Coordinated work, time and money. First thing to think about is that construction makes up 7 to 9% of the GDP of India. It's responsible for about 40 million direct and indirect jobs, so it's a very big component. However, there is a large amount of dollar value in India tied up in disputes in construction. 70,000 crore in value is in disputes, and India's resolution speed, its legal system, moves slowly, and it takes about 7 years to get a resolution to that. There have been some revisions to that in the Arbitration Act. Well, the Arbitration Act, I think it's 1995, was the original, and it's been amended in 2017 to hopefully speed that up. But that amount of value, that amount of money tied up in disputes is a loss in economic productivity. It's a loss in project productivity. And project productivity is one of the things, that's a time and money impact. Now, one of the big drivers of project productivity loss are number 3 on the list, factors affecting productivity of labor in India, amendments to the drawings and specifications. Okay, and so one of the positive aspects of design build is it should greatly reduce changes in drawings and specifications to the contractor, and that should hopefully speed up productivity, which saves time and money. So that's sort of the big driver. Now, how does that relate to construction in general? On a global scale, construction has pretty much, if you look here, this beige line right here, its productivity has changed very little over the past 30-35 years compared to the manufacturing world, as you see automation and robotics working in there, and so the general business or total economy. The financial industries, everyone else has gotten a lot more productive. Construction, not so much. And that is a big problem because that is a difference in value that can add to the economy. But there are some concerns. Why would you not want to use design build? I mean, if it saves time and money, what's the possible reasons to not use it? There are some concerns. One would be getting professional services, engineering and architecture by non-professionals or people who are unlicensed. Unlicensed practitioners can be a problem. In most instances, licensed engineers and architects have an obligation to protect public health, safety, and welfare. That's a component of their license. An unlicensed practitioner, a person who's not an architect but pretending to be one, and there is an issue with that I've seen from the IIA in India, or a person saying that they're an engineer, but they are not particularly an engineer, could expose the public health, safety, and welfare. And in the midst of this, as we deal with the COVID issue, you can imagine how that might become even more important or more sensitive to people to that issue. There is also another concern. Typically, in the design, bid, build world, you have an owner, you have a contractor, and you have a designer. And the owner has a separate contract with each. And one of the things that you hopefully get out of that is a sort of dynamic tension between the designer and the contractor. Contractors tend to focus on cost and schedule. Designers focus on different things. They may be looking more at long-term operation or reliability or other things that are not as easily placed in dollars and cents immediately. As a result, there's a kind of a pull between the two to try and get a reasonably economical and quickly installed system, but not one that compromises quality or performance. And the owner has to make a decision about the two. With an unsophisticated owner, an owner who's not familiar with design or construction or hasn't done a lot of projects, there is some concern in design build that since the two parties that typically pull against each other, design and construction, are in one entity, the owner does not get the benefit of having that sort of discussion or counterbalanced effort from engineering and construction. So there's a concern about checks and balances. So how do these project teams come together? As you can see on the chart here, you can do it a couple different ways. Sometimes a large-scale contractor can have architecture and engineering capabilities in-house, and then of course they would subcontract out various construction trades. Okay, you can have in this arrangement on the first column here. This arrangement can have the contractor be the predominant force or the architect engineer firm be the predominant force, but basically they're a blended firm. The other approach is for the owner to contract to hire a contractor, a builder, and that contractor subcontracts out architecture and engineering services. Okay, and that makes the architect, engineer, the designer, a subcontractor to the contractor, which changes the dynamics a little bit. And we can talk about that. I'll talk about that in a little bit about differences that makes. Then the other approach is you form a joint venture of some sort, either to pursue a number of design build projects, but this approach is more often used for an individual project. And you'll see this joint venture concept used often on very large scale projects like a new airport terminal or a convention center, things like that. So that's an approach that you have. You have it either all combined, you have typically contractor-led and subcontractors. It's usually not the other way around. That would be more of an EPC approach. And where you have, let's say, a joint venture formed for the purpose of pursuing design build work or purpose of pursuing a particular project. And I mentioned some variations on that. EPC, engineer, procure, construct, or EPCM, engineer, procure, construction, manage, uses a sole source, and it's often called a turnkey project. Typically, that would be an instance where there's a large engineering company and they subcontract out or hire out contractors to do the work. So that's that one in the middle that we just saw on the slide before, but where the architect engineer is in the lead. Those are really typically large projects or industrial type projects. Historically, the firms that do EPC, and there are firms that are called EPC type firms, if they had what we called captive trades, construction trades working for them, they started out in construction first and then added engineering. If they do not have captive trades and they subcontract all the field labor, they were typically design firms first and then moved into construction. They added the procurement component. Okay. Now, the last at the far end of the previous slide, I talked about joint ventures, and that's where we get into. You see often what we call a special purpose entity, and you may see that a firm created to put up a new convention center or put up a new airport terminal, and its purpose is simply that project, and it'll be a joint venture between parties. Often those projects are very, very large and very expensive, and part of the purpose of setting up that special purpose entity is there may be some interface with a government, there might be a PPP, public-private partnership going on, or the cost is so great that no single firm can handle the risk of an issue, of a problem on that project. So you'll see special purpose entities. They have their usefulness. Concerns about some special purpose entities is making sure that the management of the SPE stays focused on the project. Okay, there can be some issues with how do you allocate profits and losses. If you have two firms that form together to form a special purpose entity, and they're having trouble on some other projects in those companies, those respective companies, you have to make sure that you properly allocate those monies. And then between those two companies, how do they split up profits and losses on the particular project in question? That can be handled. And then I talk about the weight, the risk issues. So a very key consideration is that if you form a special purpose entity with another firm, you have to be very careful about not commingling funds. The money for the special project has to be kept separate from money from other projects. Oops, back up here. Okay, you have to maintain very good records, and typically one of the concerns is if you don't have enough financial capacity, you could get into problems too on that because you start pulling money from other things. Potential issues include on the legal side, and I'm not a lawyer, but include licensing and insurance. One of the things that often kind of causes some stumbling blocks, especially when engineers become contractors, is getting the proper insurances. What you typically might have for your errors and omissions or professional liability insurance is not the same as what you would have as a contractor. This problem is also exposed as contractors. What a contractor's insurance might be, contractor's general liability or buildings risk, does not cover E&O. You can get special project insurance, but often it does not cover design liability, or it doesn't cover defective workmanship in construction, okay, because it's hard to get insurance for doing what it is you're supposed to do, generally speaking. You have to get a special policy for that. With regard to joint ventures, and I say that because that seems to be a very common situation. There is the concern about, as I mentioned, insurances, and you have to be very conscious of that, and that's a growing issue within the Indian market. And then each firm wants to protect its assets that are outside of the special project, outside of the joint venture project, and they also want to protect their client base. They don't want to expose their client base, whoever their clients typically are, to the other side and start losing business, having their businesses getting pirated off. So, as I mentioned, there's the management focused issue, there's how you allocate profits and losses, and there's risk management. And we talked about the commingling of funds. So it's very important to understand those aspects when you're in a joint venture. You want to make sure that your partner is properly set up so that you can manage the thing well. So some key ingredients for getting the work done. Philosophically, you're working now as a collaborative team, and that in many instances is not how architects or engineers and contractors work. They often can seem to be adversaries. So the first thing to get is an aligned purpose. You have to work together for a win-win-win. You win, a designer wins, contractor wins, owner wins. That's the issue. So a good team chemistry is very good. It is very important to have good project definition. What are we trying to do? And it's also important to provide an appropriate design given that definition. You need to provide a design that is suitable for getting this done. And you have to think about the fact that you've entered a price If you recall the chart, the diagram that showed the bidding session, the bidding prices established early on in the project, you have to keep in mind that your design has to think about that price that you set earlier on in the project. And that is an area where, in my work, I see often a little bit of problem with that. You should have a fair contract. It's really important to have fair contracts. You can't really, it's difficult to have a successful project if the contract is grossly unfair on one side versus the other. And I say this to firms looking to do a JV. So if you're in a design firm or a construction firm and you're looking to do a joint venture, I also say this to owners. You can't make someone responsible for all risk and think that that's going to work out well. It generally does not, okay? So some other key issues. This first item, budget and schedule or the project program. Keep in mind that when you're doing a design build project, the owner does not have a full set of drawings and specs to go out and get a price. They may have only a written up description of the project. Okay, so they have an RFP and you're going to make your proposal based on that. There can be, especially with owners that don't have a lot of experience, there can be some issues with their, how should we call it, understanding of what things cost and what it takes to get a project done versus their expectation, you know, what we often refer to as champagne taste and beer money. So that can be an issue. And that is more prevalent when you have an owner that does not have a lot of experience in building. They don't know exactly what things cost. Then there's also this issue of, since you don't have full specifications, you have questions about substitutions. Can you make substitutions? Are they really substitutions? If you're a design build firm, what was the owner expecting versus what you're intending to deliver? Now, this is an area which I think actually occurs on all types of projects, but keeping in mind that you've established a price very early in the project, if the needs of the project change, an owner changes their mind or starts adding things, you get into scope creep. And I'm sure no one has ever had a project where the requirements have changed throughout the project. I'm sure that I think that happens to everybody. So that issue, and that can become very expensive because once again, in design build, you haven't had a chance for the owner to go through a full set of design documents and a full set of drawings before you've established a price. So changing your mind at this point becomes a scope creep issue, and that can negatively affect your project. Another area which is often very critical, and this is more on, let's say, a campus or where you're connecting to a bunch of other existing systems, is the scope boundary of the design build project versus some other component on the site. If I'm tying into a chilled water plant or tying into some sort of often control systems, the definition of work by others becomes very, very important. And if I'm putting a proposal together on an RFP for design build, I need to be very, very clear about the limits of my work, where I stop. And because tying into existing systems, you can get into a lot of questions about rebalancing the system once finished and things like that. And so you need to be very careful about what scope of work you're limiting yourself to. The other area where I feel that is often overlooked, defining as I mentioned here, I got to pull it back, defining the limits of your work. Also, when you are done, you need to define what completion looks like. Often I see contracts that talk about substantial completion and things like that. That can be an entire other seminar. And those are really nice words, but they don't necessarily, they're not very clear. What is substantial completion versus completion? You should also do define what you're going to do on a turnover package when you complete the work and what you're going to do for training for an owner. You need to be very clear about what you're going to provide, or you may find yourself on a project that never seems to end. So, some liability issues. Within the design build world, there's often performance specifications, and often you have sort of an expectation of a time to deliver. So you need to think about, if you're going to have some sort of warranty, What is the period of time that it covers? Is it 10 years, 5 years, forever? Often people look for 1 year and 1 year, and that really doesn't do it for a lot of complicated projects. Do you need a performance bond? Do you need the subcontractors to match up and have the same kind of bond? Then you can get into implied warranties, and those are warranties that are not defined by contract but implied by law. Warranties of habitability, for example, are required because if I'm building a building for people to be in, it has to be habitable. And if I'm not an architect or I don't have a licensed architect, that may be difficult to get. You might not be able to get a certificate of occupancy. You can exclude some of these items by contract, but you have to be unambiguous. It has to be very clear in your contract that that's what you're doing. Okay? The items that determine some liability are what's in your contract, whether or not you've expressly warranted a design or performance, and be careful about doing that, and how much the owner's involvement or the quality of the owner's information with respect to that. And we see that often an area of concern. Owners, remember, they haven't developed a full design, they have some RFP, that RFP might not be very well developed, and you could have a problem with that. So with risk, as I mentioned before, you want to be realistic. Do not expect to shift risk to an entity within the project without him or her charging you for that shift, okay? In traditional project, design, bid, build, the design risk is with the owner because the design professional works as an agent for the owner. The construction risk is with the contractor. Schedule, that depends on who's causing the delay, if there's an impact on schedule. Cost, that depends on who's impacting the cost. In design build execution, the design risk is with the design build entity because they are both designer and contractor. Since they're designer and contractor, they also have the construction risk and the cost risk. Assuming the owner hasn't asked for additional things, the cost risk is on the design build entity. So if the price of things goes up in the marketplace, you can't go back to the owner and say, hey, I need more money. Not necessarily. On the schedule risk, same thing. As long as the owner hasn't interfered, there's no particular reason why the job should take any extra time to do. So now, setting up these business entities. You can do, well, corporations or a structure, a separate structure. You need to think about how it's going to be owned, what's going to be the risk exposure, what kind of assets, taxes. You can talk about partnerships, okay? You have general partners or limited liability partners, and they have different levels of exposure and risk. Limited liability companies, which is sort of a hybrid between a corporation and a partnership. And you have different ways in which the liabilities break out. You should talk to an accountant and an attorney to work those out, the details out of those items, depending upon your marketplace. And I understand we have people from different places here. So on a planning perspective, you have to think about things like your administrative support for your project, how your logistics, where are we going to put things, how are we going to lay things out. Remember, you don't have a full set of documents when you put your pricing together. So you need to think about those in your proposal because you can't add them later on. Some overlooked items often are resource constraints, labor, electricity, water, those things. Supply constraints, your supply chain, that has become a much more critical issue and will become even more so. Acceptance criteria, as I mentioned before, defining when you are done. Startup and testing, how do you transfer the project from your role as a design builder to the owner's role in operating? And then you need to think about sort of operational constraints, what may limit you from operation. For example, I've seen projects get into trouble where they're using piles as a method of foundations, and they're near a hospital, and you can't drive piles when you're near a hospital. So it starts limiting your ability to the times you can work. And suddenly, that greatly affects the schedule. So early on, I think it's important to identify your assumptions, keeping in mind that you do not have full documents. You need to think about your resources, labor, materials, and equipment. Can you get things there in time? Is there enough qualified labor to get the work done? On what kind of project conditions you might have. Infrastructure, existing infrastructure. Is there sufficient infrastructure to get the job done? What kind of transport or communications you might need. And then there's other things. If a client has an existing series of buildings, they might wish to use the same control system or limit the type of equipment that you can use in order to have consistency across their platform. That is very useful for an owner and it makes a lot of sense. But if you haven't accommodated that in your, or thought about that in your proposal, you could find yourself having trouble with pricing or deliveries. Okay, if he says, well, I can only use certain manufacturer for all my pumps. I did not price that manufacturer. I'll have to go change my numbers. So you need to be very careful and clear about what you're putting in your project. As I mentioned, the neighbors, what are the conditions that I'm going to be constructing in? Okay, and then of course the testing and turnover and what the economic drivers are for his project. So some concerns about for the designer. As I mentioned earlier, there is that sort of tug of war between construction cost and schedule and design intent. And it is very important for designers to remember that in the design build context, they are a partner with the contractor as well as, let's say, working for an owner. And often, especially in the instance where the designer is subcontracted by the contractor, that becomes a major issue. Your client is actually the contractor. It is not necessarily the owner. And that's a difference for most engineers and architects to work with. Okay. Substitutions. You don't have a full set of documents, so you need to be careful about what an owner will accept as a substitution or a piece of equipment, a vendor, a manufacturer, or if it's totally up to the design build entity. What is the intent? What did the owner expect versus what is your expectation? What did the design build contractor plan to provide? There is an issue in the world of scheduling called the float. And one of the things that I've seen have a negative impact is as you're working through that refinement portion that I showed early on, where you're finishing the detailed design while construction is going on, if you start to delay the delivery of the design work, you can negatively impact the schedule in construction. And you can't blame the owner because the owner said you're a single entity and you're supposed to deliver the project. You have to be very conscious as a designer about the construction schedule being done. I mentioned up above, and talking about these aspects for the designer, there's a concept called the standard of care. You're supposed to provide a certain level of design quality, a certain level of professional services. Typically, your standard of care is owed to, if you're a licensed professional, public health, safety, and welfare, and it's also owed to your client. Most times, design professionals think of their clients as the owners. In a design build entity, it is not necessarily the owner of the building. Your client may be the contractor. So you have to think of to whom you owe that standard of care. And we've seen a number of disputes arise out of that sort of mind, out of that sort of problem. So from an owner, without that push and pull, that tension, tug of war between designer and builder, projects can be often talked about as having a project stool. You have, I can do it very well, high quality. I can do it very fast, high speed, or I can do it for very expensive, high cost. You can control two items in there. You can talk about quality and speed, but the cost will change to satisfy those requirements. You can talk about speed and cost, but your quality will change to match what speed and cost you have. So you have to be conscious of what you're trying to control to, okay? Typically, builders think about speed and cost. Designers think more about quality and cost. And so you can have a little bit of a pull as an owner. If you don't have internal people who can help you with that, you could run into a problem that way. On complex problems where you have to, or complex projects where you have to match up to existing systems, there is a question about sort of getting the best price on your design build project versus matching up to your existing systems. And then of course, as an owner, you have to have very strict self-discipline. You can't let yourself change your mind constantly on the project. But what is a good useful thing to do is get unit cost pricing data or a menu schedule of values for certain elements, or you can put a cost allowance in for areas that are on hold or awaiting some detailed design, okay? Areas where you might not be certain. That pops up in high-tech buildings like hospitals or laboratories often. So on the contract side, there's the term sticks and carrots. I prefer carrots. Owners, if you're putting together an RFP for a design build project, you might want to consider extending the warranty periods on the project, or at least a 1 or 2 year O&M contract. What you're trying to do is you're trying to make sure that you don't get something that is fast and cheap but does not last. And so I want to try and disincentivize save now and pay later mindsets. So you can think about shared savings plans, and they work somewhat. You can think about some bonuses for exceeding business performance, but sometimes that's a little bit difficult to do for an office building, let's say. But I think what is important to try and do is I would look at extended warranty periods or some sort of O&M contract. I don't want cheap now, cheap and fast, but it doesn't last, because it's not a good investment for me. Negative reinforcement, and a lot of people like to do this. And you'll see this on all types of projects. Liquidated damages, so if you're late, you pay a penalty for being late. I also think if you're going to have late liquidated damage for delay, it might not be a bad idea to think about some sort of bonus for early completion. You should have, both sides of the coin, so to speak. This idea, satisfaction testing, some sort of acceptance testing. I have done work in the past where you do profit at risk based on some sort of satisfaction survey. You have to have a really good relationship with the owner to do that kind of work, but it's a method of getting it, a method of providing some motivation to everybody to do a good job. In India, I looked into the contract world. I don't see a lot of standard contract forms, but it seems that FIDIC, and I don't know if people are familiar with FIDIC, is used fairly regularly in the industrial market in India for design build work. This would be FIDIC's yellow book, and that comes out of the International Federation of Consulting Engineers, which is headquartered in Switzerland, I do believe. But FIDIC, I've seen a lot in international work. And then there's the Institute of Indian Architects. They have a set of contract documents, but I've not seen a specific design build contract document amongst them. But that might be a way to go. You can look into American forms too, but there's one other that I'll talk about a little bit later. So, utilizing it effectively, team skills, owner experience. Does an owner have experience with design build and how it differs from design bid build? That can be important. Your design build entity qualifications. Are you familiar with the type of work? Are you familiar with each other as you're forming an alliance? Do you have the proper incentives? You want to make sure people are motivated in the right way. And you want to try and have as much of an alliance as possible and not strictly a business relationship. You want to have a strong working relationship, okay? You're going to have an integrated planning process. You want to bring people into the project early. If you're going to go do that type of work in design build, you want to get a cross-disciplinary involvement to your team. Why is planning so important anymore? Projects are a lot more complex. We have a lot more high performance targets. People are looking for sustainable buildings or net zero buildings and things like that. That requires a great degree of sophistication, okay? Adaptability. People want future proofing. They want their buildings to be able to live into the future, adapting and changing with different requirements. New pressures on things like resiliency, because changes in the environment, changes in climate, things like that, floods, things like that are making it much more critical to think about early planning so that I can deal with these kinds of abnormal situations. And of course, the integration aspect of getting the project delivered well. It's always and always important, and one of the drivers of design build, how quickly can we get this project done and online, and what is the return on investment or life cycle cost for the capital expenditure. So time and money continue to be the drivers of most of these projects, but now we have these other sort of outside or additional elements that people are looking for. So planning is key. A design build project is often basically a performance project. So it's very important to understand the scope, what is going on, what you're providing in the project and what you are not providing, okay? And I think a lot of times people do a pretty decent job about what they are providing, but they are not very clear about what they are not providing. And sometimes it is hard to determine exactly where the break line is. So you need to be careful about what you're not doing, okay? There are some projects, you have to be careful about it because a lot of design build work is done with a lump sum bid, okay? And so that becomes it's very important for you to manage your process to keep in line with that lump sum. And you need to be careful about implied or expressed warranties. From an owner's perspective, you should be looking at capacity, you should define quality level and some performance requirements. You should be clear about what you want post-construction, what kind of training, how long you want them to be on site, or as a warranty goes, and what kind of documentation you want, okay? Because remember, you don't necessarily have the same sorts of things that you'd have in a design build project going into construction. So you need to tell the design build entity, I want record drawings, I want as-builts, I want O&M manuals, because there's no specification to tell them to do that. And if you have some goals or testing or acceptance criteria, you should specify that in writing. Cost management, critical element. It's very critical, and that for the design build entity, you're going to be responsible for that. If there's spots where you need the owner's input, indicate where on that schedule you need them and where they need to make decisions. If they don't make certain decisions in a certain time frame, you have to document that event, tell them what the impact is, and let the owner know, because it's very important that the owner make timely decisions when necessary, okay? As I mentioned before, you're going to have less design documentation when you start the project, but at the end of the day, the same work is going to have to be done. So it's good to think about how you're going to manage that value, okay? The type of documentation will vary from project to project. What I need for a commercial office building may be different than what I need for a hospital. More complex projects tend to require more detailed scope documents or RFP information. You'll see something referred to as a two-step design build or a bridging set. And in sort of complex projects, very often there's a bridging set of documents. It's a more detailed RFP than just what's written on a page. It's going to be maybe some more complicated drawings and things like that. Okay, you need to think about your cost control strategies, the desired intent, what you're intending to do, the type of quality, how you expect to use it, and any sort of performance or critical schedule issues that you see in the project. Okay, so from a delivery perspective, clients in a design build sometimes think that they get to step away, okay, and not have anything to do with the project. That's not true, but also they can't get so involved that they eliminate the flexibility that design build gives you, okay? So you have to be very conscious to guard against scope creep or change orders, because it's very difficult to negotiate prices on change orders in design build. They often end up very expensive. Clients, owners, you have to be careful to not have your people interfere with the ability of getting the work done, because that's going to cost time and money. Now, a question is, as I mentioned, you don't have that tension, that tug of war between design and construction. So how do you as an owner get the quality that you expected, or get the quality that you paid for, what you thought you paid for? That's going to be up to your RFP, your request for proposal, or request for quotation that you issue out, okay? You can't determine the construction means and methods. If you do, you potentially impact the cost. If you want something done a certain way, you need to define that up front. The quality control and quality assurance, in large measure, the design build entity has to self-referee their performance, because they don't have an outside person. There's not a contractor having an engineer come in and kind of make comments, or a contractor making comments on an engineer's design. it's all one entity. So you're self-refereeing, you're self-controlling. Any additional risks? For the design build entity, price risks of products in the marketplace, schedule guarantees, if you have a plant performance guarantee, there could be some sort of site-specific risk, obviously logistic and safety. Those are always things in contracting, but for a lot of design build firms, engineers in design build, they're not used to thinking about these. They don't usually deal with those items. They don't deal with price items, price risk in the marketplace, okay? For an owner, you will still have site conditions, generally speaking. You will have any legacy issues, things that they're connecting to. An item that does pop up on occasion is who owns the design from an intellectual property perspective. If you put one building up as a design build, does that owner have the right to take those same documents and go bid to do another copy of that building someplace else? That becomes an issue. Dispute resolution. One of the goals of design build is to reduce the number of disputes, okay? There are disputes that come up. Portions of that come in a failure to meet, let's say, the owner's intent. And that is because the RFP might not be clear about what the owner's intended is. If there's a hard schedule, for example, you're doing a school, there's a very tight schedule with a very fixed schedule for that. Failure to meet schedule will be a dispute. Failure to meet a budget, and that can be from a very complicated argument, because if I've given a budget and it's a lump sum bid, a hard price, the owner has not interfered. If it goes over, that's an internal problem for the design build firm. And I've actually seen those issues pop up regularly where the contractor feels that the engineer that was subcontracted, was subcontracted with him, has problems getting the work done, okay? And where I see the issue is you'll have a general contractor, they subcontract work out, the design work, to an architect engineer, and they also subcontract work out to other engineering trades. And then they can get into some challenges with regard to how that work gets done. I talked a little bit before here about design build and using a two-step approach or bridging documents. And then, of course, thinking about liability and your contractual limits of liability clauses. And that's door four. So, some big things coming in the world. BIM. I assume many of you are looking at BIM as a methodology for documenting projects. BIM is definitely there. It's getting bigger all the time. So if you're not doing it, start doing it, because you're going to be doing it. One of the things that BIM kind of drives to is this issue of virtual design and construction. We're going to start seeing more and more of that, where we're basically building the building electronically in a model before we actually start building it on the site. If you do your VR, virtual reality, well, you can actually have an owner put on those little glasses and almost experience being in the room before you build things. It's a great way to control, oh, I didn't know it was going to work like that, or I'm not comfortable with XYZ, before you build things. It takes a bit more time at the front end, but it hopefully reduces the amount of problems at the back end of the project. In the world of BIM, there's sort of the 3D version, which is just sort of the model. But you can talk about 4D, where you tie the model to scheduling elements. You can talk about 5D BIM, where you're tying schedule, construction schedule, as well as pricing, okay? 6D, where you can start doing energy models and other things like that, predictive energy models or operating energy models based in the model, based out of the model, okay? And then 7D is where an owner is really using it as an asset management tool. We are slowly seeing, and I would say right now we're comfortably in a lot of projects, 3D and 4D, and 5D is creeping in. People are using the sustainability models, but they don't use them as an ongoing operating tool, but this 7D is coming. Another area where we start looking at now, you start hearing about people talking about digital twins, okay? And that's basically building, you can build a city block, you can build a whole complex as an electronic model, and then you can compare that to what your actual is doing. But that's where the industry is going, a high technology industry. And the purpose of that is productivity, is improving productivity and cost performance. I suspect you are seeing more and more in India off-site or modular construction. That's going to be another big element of the workforce that we're doing. And that, of course, has a lot of tie-ins to BIM. Okay, because of BIM, I can do modular construction in a great way. And there's a lot of advantage to that. Quality is better on, on a factory floor than it is out in the site. It's safer, and I can deliver things quickly. Some drawbacks. It's not very good for dealing with changes because I've already made a bunch of stuff and I brought it out to the site. So it's not as flexible, but improved quality, lower cost generally, and faster delivery. The modular construction market is growing. You'll see it a lot in health and housing, but now you see it more in hospitality, healthcare, educational institutions, and the Asia Pacific modular construction market is growing to it's projected to be, well, this is 2018, about $20 billion. But as I mentioned, improved productivity, better quality control, and reduced waste compared to on-site fabrication. It's going to be a big thing. BIM helps it. Okay. I don't know how many people have heard about lean construction. Lean construction is a approach to delivering capital projects in the construction phase. It's like a Six Sigma continuous process improvement for construction. Back to that chart I showed where the productivity of the construction industry has been relatively flat for about the past 35 years, where all other productivities have improved. This is an effort to improve that and have less waste in both time and effort and material waste on the construction site. But lean construction is the thing you're going to see. And to an extent, the design build overlaps with lean because of that coordination and better communication between members of the team. Other types of projects that you'll see. Design build is here, okay? But you have variations on design build. Design build finance, design build operate, maintain, okay? And those are all variations on that theme. Design build transfer. You'll see that happening in much more in the world of public-private partnerships. And you're probably seeing PPP jobs go on as people try and find ways to, especially municipalities, to execute projects with limited capital. So that's going to be a bigger thing. In order to be participating in that, you need to be able to participate in some of these kind of components. When you start talking about finance, that usually requires bigger firms or construction firms because they have better finance capability. An item I kind of touched on, has anyone worked with the new engineering contract? It is sort of a contract been developed by the UK Institution of Civil Engineers, seen it used in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, and Republic of South Africa. Its big points are plain language clauses. It's very simple, not a lot of legalese lawyer talk. It's very modular, so you can take portions of it and add sections together to get the kind of project you're doing. It's very adaptable, and it's very much focused on collaboration and alliance work. So the first was the NEC3 family, which I think came out in 2005. But recently, there's the NEC4 new members. They've added the alliance contract, which is partnering, the integrated design, integrated project delivery, basically, and the design build operate contract component. So now they have express sections for design build contracts, and they have a section on dispute resolution services. So I think these are both good areas to investigate as an alternative, especially if you have a client that doesn't necessarily have a lot of experience or doesn't have his own contract. So what do I think is going to happen here? The purpose of design build is trying to speed up, improve productivity, okay, from the collaboration and contracting side, design and engineering side. You can see here some significant savings if we can improve that. If we can improve the collaboration and contracting, design, engineering, and procurement, wow. If we can start talking about doing on-site execution and improve that and employ some technology, we can see some significant improvements in contract construction productivity. And that's what the name of the game is, construction productivity. We want to try and get it to be more productive, save money, save time. Now, some impacts of COVID. I think the COVID-19 is going to change some things. There's going to be some additional crew measures required, okay, which is going to increase the amount of disposable equipment, masks and things like that, little gloves that you previously didn't use. And they're going to have to do that because you can't have half your workforce sick all the time or a quarter of them. That's just no good. Social distancing. To the extent that people are going to want to see that continue, you're going to have to think about how you sequence and stage your trades on site. They can't all be working in an area because they wouldn't be able to maintain the 2-meter social distance. Okay, so that's going to impact how I get people through the construction process. When do I stage trades? Systems and equipment engineering. There's going to be more time required for cleaning. Okay, cleaning systems once they're finished installed, cleaning sites. I know that we've done it for a long time in pharmaceutical and hospital work, but shipping ductwork out to the job site wrapped in plastic to seal the insides, there's going to be more emphasis on that. Better filtration in HVAC systems. You can now probably expect to see, I guess it'd be MERV 15 and 90, 95% filters on many systems that previously you wouldn't have done that on. I expect that those little throwaway filters that we are used to seeing, you're probably going to see that stuff slowly die out, okay, because people are going to be looking for filters. And there may become a need for additional systems, active filtration, some sort of carbon filtration, or UVC lamping and return air systems or possibly in whole spaces. So there's going to be some additional equipment that way. And all of that is going to be response to this current pandemic issue. And a heightened O&M expectation is going to be required. People are going to expect owners and operators to do a better job of maintaining their buildings. The last thing I think is going to be very critical, because we saw some weak spots, supply chains. Supply chains are fragile. If we lose some element in that supply chain, we need to have methods to think about working around it. There's an old saying about never putting all of your eggs in one basket, because if you drop your basket, you break all your eggs. I think that this pandemic issue, as well as a couple other things recently, are making people seriously think about their supply chain. Maybe it's not the best thing to seek the last possible dollar in savings on every item. Maybe it's good to get my suppliers have multiple suppliers from different places, so that I'm protect a little bit against a 100% loss if one of them goes offline. So with that, any questions or discussion or whatever, we can delve into that.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Swan. There is one question. How successful is design build with peer review and a commissioning agent? Would this not be a win-win model?
The commissioning side can become an interesting one, and that is because, and as well as peer review, since you don't have a lot of documentation up front, the peer review can be of limited value. I think the peer review actually, if an owner if you want to do a smart thing, you would have a peer review of the RFP to make sure that it's actually asking for what needs to be asked for. And it might be wise, and I've seen this happen, and I've actually worked on a couple of resolving disputes where it would have been beneficial to have a peer review of the design provided by the engineer who was subcontracted to the general contractor, because the design ended up having to be changed and it created some major cost problems in getting the project done. And there is no ability to go back to the owner and ask for more money because they bid the job as a lump sum. So now they have to find a way to solve it. I think there's an opportunity for peer review. It's going to be in two spots, both on the owner's RFP and the design build contractor's delivery. It'll be a little smaller than if it was continuous over the job, but it is in those two areas. And then on commissioning, it depends on. See, the people want the commissioning agent to be brought in early on. There's not a lot of design documentation to look at early on for commissioning. An owner could combine their peer review function with a commissioning agent who's going to do the work downstream. The drawback to that is making sure there's no conflict of interest. If I made a bunch of suggestions as a peer review at the front end of the project, I certainly don't want to have those items become problems in commissioning at the back end of the project, because then I didn't really do a very good job of advising. So I can see the challenge on the commissioning side. There's you'd have to bring the commissioning agent in sometime while the design build entity is doing their design, and I would suggest that commissioning agent be retained by the owner. I'm not a big
So can I just
there.
So can I just explain this to you? Actually, that question was put up by me. So I'll just explain. I exactly agree with whatever you're saying. The whole advantage of this is that because there are no, in India, actually, there is no certification for a contractor, or there's no license for a contractor. So the design build model generally becomes, we don't have to buy a license. We are not, as contractors, we have never said that you buy this license, and if you fail on a particular contract, this is the amount of insurance that you need to compensate. So the industry as such in India right now is not reached that level of maturity. Now, to make the contracts more successful in India, to see that, and I fully agree with your concept of a design build contract, because I think a design build contract is the best thing that can happen to an owner if his interests are protected. Now, to protect his interests, as you rightly said, there's a peer review consultant. So at the time when I put in my design build, let's say my design build proposal, and you're the owner, it is the right time for the peer review consultant to have reviewed the whole design and the list of makes, what are being suggested. And the concept of commissioning agent, as what we understand, though it's not very prevalent in India just now, is that he reports to the owners directly. So he's not under pressure from the peer review consultant or the contractor, or maybe the designer architect, if at all there is one. So he reports to the owner to see that whatever was spelled out in the RFP is actually implemented, and it is carried over till the end, till the O&M documentation and the handing over is done. So maybe this model, if implemented correctly, will be a wonderful model for the design build, contracts to pick up.
Yes, I think I think the design builders, I think it's a combination of owners recognizing the value of having that independent look, that independent set of eyes, and it might be worthwhile if you're a quality design build firm and you want to do good work and you want to separate yourself from the other people who are just trying to get something done quick. You might want to suggest to some owners, it might be worth your while to bring in a third person. We can give you suggest some names, but they'd report to you. They'd report to the owner. It's funny that you mentioned about the liability and insurance issue. I know I spoke in India, probably the first time was maybe 2007 or so. And I know I talked about risk, and some people said, oh, we really don't have that problem here. And I know, speaking with a couple of fellows in subsequent years, that issue was growing. That issue was growing. I remember you had the, was it the Asia Games that were in India a couple years back, and the stadiums weren't finished and things weren't done right, and that's somewhere along the line, someone has to deal with that economic impact, because there's a cost associated with having that condition, and you're going to have that issue as the economic activity gets higher and higher value. Someone's going to want some sort of protection for their work. They're going to need that, but it's going to get there. Hopefully, it won't be as bad as the U.S. in terms of lawyers, because I got to tell you, I don't know if anybody's listening from the U.S. Hopefully not. We use a lot of lawyers, so and that can be a bit much. But at some point, somebody's going to have to start reconciling what was some sort of, how do I call it, qualifications of contractors to make sure they do good work and that they're qualified to do what they're doing.
That's my next question to you, that why aren't there any certifying agencies who can actually certify contractors, just as you have certified products. You see, when we are talking of a certified cooling tower, we're talking of certified chillers. Why can't we talk of certified contractors, based on whatever their past track record is, or their past performances, or the kind of risk that they're able to take, in terms of offering an insurance. If I am a confident contractor and I believe that I can deliver a particular project to the best of my capability, I should be able to indemnify my owner maybe 30 times or 40 times the value of the project if I fail. So if there is a certification that happens for contractors, and somebody who's willing to take up that, there is somebody who picks up the reins of certifying contractors or becomes a certifying agency for the contractors, I think that'll push the design build industry in a very big way, and that is actually that'll be the future, and that'll be the win situation for the owners.
I mean, I think it would be a big change. I think sometimes maybe, and maybe this is just a difference in the words, use of the words. The certification of the contractor might be hard to do because each project is different and it's assembled by different tradespeople. So you can get some quality variations. But a lot of projects in the United States, the owner requires what we call a bond. He requires a surety bond, which is actually sort of as it says. And so a contractor has to show up showing that they have insurance, a surety bond, so that if the contractor doesn't complete it, the owner can go to that surety and say, you must find a contractor who finishes this work properly, and you will pay for it with that surety bond, and the owner doesn't pay. So that's a method of kind of establishing that certification that you're talking about, because the contractors that routinely don't do that, don't get their work done, don't do a good job, what happens is the surety companies don't like to work with them. And so they charge them a very high cost for that insurance. So effectively, it's sort of like if you were a taxi driver and you kept having accidents, your auto insurance company would say, well, we're going to charge you a lot of money because you keep hitting things with your car. And if you don't hit things, you get a better price. So it slowly but surely kind of forces the bad contractors to either improve or get out of the business because they're not competitive. But what you have to have is owners that request a bond. And that's, I talked about a performance bond. Owners can request, they can say, anybody bidding this job has to have a performance bond. And you can do that on design build work. But you're correct. Without some objective method of determining whether the contractors are any good, the owner is left trying to make a guess. And if they're an unsophisticated owner, hasn't done a lot of construction, they're going on somebody's, some person's, a friend's recommendation that they got at the bar. I mean, that's not a really solid way to do it. It exposes a lot of risk. But I think you're right. It's some sort of method. We have licensing for contractors, but even in the licensing for contractors, that bar is fairly easy to clear. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a great contractor. It just means you you've got a license, your business is operating and all that sort of stuff. There's a big gap between being licensed and being good.
So one more question is, what percentage of contracts in the US now are design build, sir? And will the developing economies slowly move towards, little that I understand is that the US has moved, I think, primarily towards design build contracts.
I don't know if I would say primarily, but it's bigger. It's probably 35% of the work, and it depends a lot on the type of work. Okay, so a lot of residential is design build, and if you have a client that has a very good sense of what they want, a lot of retail is design build. Commercial office, not as much. Laboratories, things like that. Things where an owner may change their mind a lot, design build is probably not the way they want to go. If you're not certain about what you want, design build is probably, as an owner, it's probably not the ideal delivery for you. If you're certain about what you want, then you can write it up in an RFP and you're not going to make a lot of changes. It's a good methodology. But we're seeing a big movement towards it, a big movement. And of course, government projects, public projects, we've a long time hit a lot of laws that really made design build impossible in the public sector because of worries about collusion. Not getting necessarily competitive bids. So they're actually making changes in a lot of public work to try and go design build. And they're slowly but surely getting there. But it's, I would say it's probably 35–40% of the marketplace now is going design build.
Sure. Thank you, sir. Thanks.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It's definitely a big item. There's a lot of growth in it all over. Matter of fact, I was reading some stuff in prep for this. Asia seems to be probably one of the leading growth markets for design build. What COVID does is going to be very interesting. There's going to be some new requirements. But this couple months of no activity is going to create a need for people to kind of accelerate projects and get back to schedules. Okay, you know, because schedules are really damaged.
I think it will help people to innovate. I think what you're saying is right. It will have to, the industry will have to move to modular. I think that's the future. I think US is mostly now moved to the modular construction. I think they're encouraging a lot of modular construction. And I think this post-COVID-19, I think that will be one of the largest changes that will happen is that I think it'll move lesser to site activity and more to maybe off-site activities.
Yes, it's much easier to control that social distancing and safety and exposure and all that when you're doing modular than it is out at the job site. Because I can reduce the amount of time I have guys working in an uncontrolled manner on some construction site. So modular construction offers you a much better control for that.
True.
Yeah. So
yeah, thank you once again. So
thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Tran.
Hopefully I get a chance to come out to Jaipur again.
Yeah, thank you for delivering the insightful talk. And I would also like to thank to all the participants who have attended this webinar.
Yes,
and
thank you
thanks
all
to Mr. Osama.
Yeah, for your Saturday evening.
No, it's wonderful. I think it's a very interesting talk, and I think that's the future. Design build, in my opinion, also is the future. I think it's a very relevant topic to have picked up in the post-COVID-19 situation.
Oh yeah.
So I think it's been very enlightening. So it's always very nice to come up with something innovative. I think it's wonderful. That's great.
Thank you very much. I think it's going to be the way to go. Yeah. So what I will do is I will bundle up the presentation and send you a PDF so that you can make it available. And you said now it's going to be on YouTube. I'll be a star.
Yeah, yeah, we will update. We
Okay.
will update our YouTube channel by this recording, and you can
Okay.
also send me the PPT. I will
Okay, I
forward
will.
to all the attendees. Yeah,
That's true. I will take care of that for you today. Sounds wonderful.
yeah. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Okay.
Okay. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
All right. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye.